Sally Brown, known to some of you in person and some of you by my publications and some of you because you might have seen my activity on Twitter and so on. It's a real delight to be working with you for this seminar on QAA Scotland on an area that matters a great deal to me, that is to say compassionate assessment. And all this is being said in the context of the very difficult 6 months we've had in universities. Some of you may have seen some of the work that Kay Samble and I have been putting together on assessment in COVID times. I'll be referring to that a bit later. But may I say how delighted I was to be invited to work with friends and colleagues in Scotland. I live in England, just over the border, but I've worked in lots of universities in Scotland for quite a lot of times. Over the last 40 years, I've been working in higher education. So it's one of a series of events. Gareth and Tanya have gone ahead of me. I'm hoping this will build on their excellent work, thinking about student engagement and student well-being and so on. But actually, I'm also today thinking about the well-being of the people who are involved in the assessment, as well as the students. This is what it sometimes looks like, isn't it, assessment? Can you recall those kinds of rooms? Can you recall the feeling? Can you recall the smell? A mixture of sweat, panic, unwashed hair, and decomposing trainers. And what I'd rather have is something a bit more compassionate. Now, I don't know whether I've coined the term compassionate assessment. I've been reading a bit about compassionate education, about it being, we would hope, equitable, intellectually challenging. That's what we want our assessment to be like. We want it to be a complex combination of cognitive perspective, affective state, intention, motivation, that gives rise to cooperative and altruistic behaviour. That sounds like a pretty good aim for compassionate assessment. And for me, it means designing, managing, conducting assessment in ways that recognise that students have real lives, that recognise that we have real lives, those of us assessing them and managing them, and that we need to make sure our assessment is inclusive, just, authentic, challenging intellectually, positive, in a way that leaves students coming out of it with something definitively positive in the affective domain, rather than diminished and reduced like so much assessment does. We know it's a really high stress activity for students and staff. And these stresses arise for them and for us from all of these things, from the fact everybody's got to do it at the same time. And that means all that issue about security and danger of exam questions leaking out and all that sort of thing. It's got to be done within a limited time, an hour, 2 hours, 3 hours, just putting the extra pressure on, back to that sweaty room again. And in ways that just don't match the needs of some of our students, and in venues which are impersonal, rented in. I've heard people say, well, we've got to do an exam because we rented the exam hall 6 months in advance. So they're crammed in, and there's often no real reason why we're doing it in that way, because we have mistaken premises. They mustn't work together, they can't be trusted, actually being able to memorise stuff is the most important thing. And there's also this awful thing that you have one go to succeed. It's an end point of learning, rather than, as I would rather see it, something that's part of learning, dug completely into the assessment for learning literature that I worked on with Liz McDowell and Kay Samble decades ago, and that still has high relevance. This is the message we often say to students. This photo was actually taken in Ireland, but it's a message we see. Not allowed in, students must keep out. We are keeping it a secret process that we have the power over. And it's not just exams that are stressful. Anything that has a fixed time scale in a particular place, like a lab or a studio or a placement, where we're not trusting them, where there are confused messages to students about what we want from them. And anything that's a single heroic test of their worth is going to put pressure on individuals. Now, I know people say that we have to have ways of testing students if they can work under pressure. But is an exam the real way of doing it? I'd much prefer to have a ward manager in training giving a test that asks her or him to consider what life might be like and what they might have to deal with on a day-to-day basis through an in-tray or an in-box exercise rather than a formal exam. So we want to really think about making the assessment suitable for the student, for the context, for the course, for the level. And in level, we might want to think about making sure assessment that's undertaken in the first semester of the first year, which might be all about confidence building, and comparing that with where we want to be at end point, where we're testing fitness for practice and suitability for the qualification we're offering. They're going to be different kinds of assessment. I like what Lisa Dickinson, Canadian, says about language of assessment lacking compassion. We want to shift it from prescription to invitation. We don't want to come across as mean or untrusting. We need to pay attention to the tone, and I would say go and have a look at your regulations, have a look at your briefings, see how you are framing it. Often our registry like us to embody it in a language that's very legalistic. But how are students, particularly those from disadvantaged backgrounds or those from an international background, going to understand the nuances of words like condonement and mitigation? We need to make sure that when we're talking to them, in the video briefs or the audio briefs that we give them, in our rubrics, in the documentation that's student facing, that it's humane and recognises their anxieties and their genuine concerns about whether it's going to be treating them fairly and effectively, testing them on what they know rather than trying to catch them out on what they don't know. And thinking about staff, I know from having been a senior manager, having been a PVC, that if we look at the high stress points, the bits where we have real problems with mental health problems, where people just decide they can't go on any longer, that's often mapping directly onto high assessment periods. And if you double the number of students on a programme, I'll brook no refusal on this, you need to make other arrangements. You can't just keep assessing in the same way you do with the same number of assessors. I had an experience myself when we were working with a group of staff who simply did not feel they could turn work round in the timescales we wanted them to do, only to find that their dean, would you believe it, was timetabling them for overseas teaching during the marking periods, which meant of course they couldn't get it done in the 3-week turnaround. We had to be very fierce with him and say he's going to have to put more deployment into there, either different staff to do the overseas teaching or different staff to do the assessment. You can't just do everything with minimal numbers of staff. And thinking too about the ways in which we ourselves mark, how we're often reading scanned handwritten scripts or having to try and upload marks onto some daft university system that isn't designed to be accessible. Actually, I don't know what it's designed for very often. That's stressful. So just thinking about the last 6 months, everybody has been under more pressure than ever before around assessment. For the students, it's the worry, working from home, sometimes students are working with an ironing board as a desk or under a blanket in their bedroom to get some peace and quiet. Often they've got caring responsibilities. I watch my own son and daughter-in-law managing homeschooling alongside everything else. We need to recognise that this is on top of normal stress, but also same things apply to the staff, to the academics, learning support staff, librarians, quality assurers, educational developers, everybody. We've all had to do the best we can in the conditions which are often suboptimal. We pulled it off, but we never want to be in the same position again. And thinking too with compassion of the senior managers who've often had to work really fast and make decisions really fast. Most of the senior managers I've encountered have not come from a strong pedagogic background. They're often from engineering, science, technology, those kinds of backgrounds. And so for them, making decisions about assessment has meant a lot of reliance on external sources, their educational developers, or people like me and Kay Samble, to make matters workable. So this has been a tough time for all of us. So I mentioned Kay Samble and I have been producing materials, I'm calling it 6 to 8 because there's a couple in the pipeline, in 4 distinct phases. I'm going to show you these in a moment. Emergency planning, what the heck can we do in the first instance? Switching to other formats, particularly open book exams, different ways of assessing rather than unseen time constrained exams, which we did a handy pros and cons table, and then thinking about if we're going to make changes for good, we don't have to go back to the same old way. We need to rethink question design, systems, methods and processes. 2 down, some more to come. So this is an ongoing process. If you're interested, here are the key places where we've been working. You can see that takes us through those 4 phases, and as we do additional things, we're adding them there. That's my site. But Kay Samble's also got them on her site as well. Kay and I work together at Northumbria, and she and I have been working quite extensively in the time I've been alongside her at Edinburgh Napier, who were kind enough a couple of years ago to give me an honorary doctorate. Many people behave as if exams were the gold standard, the best way of assessing students. We've seen government ministers in the last few weeks actually saying that in relation to the A-level fiasco, Scottish Highers fiasco. I think lots of people who are in senior posts have done terribly well themselves in formal exams and therefore think it's the best, the most rigorous way. And they think that you need that level of stress because if students can't hack it, they don't deserve to achieve in higher education, which is not a position I share. And they also think that the only way to counteract all this cheating and plagiarism and all that sort of thing is to have exams. Actually, there's many other ways of doing it. We've got to design inappropriate academic conduct out, and exams are not the only solution. Besides, there are always, every year, students who get away with cheating in exams. It isn't a cheat-proof mechanism. We would argue, therefore, that assessment for the future must offer authentic assessment. That is, assessing what we really wanted to assess, things that are life relevant, things that involve students developing autonomy and independence, self-regulation, rather than being tutor-directed every minute of the time. We want things that are going to place as much emphasis on how the students got there as the outcome. And they've got to be subject relevant and contextualised. They've got to show students can source and prioritise and use reference material. They've got to be able to follow academic standards. But we've got to make sure that whatever we do is going to be ensuring flexibility for what we know is around the corner. I don't think there's anybody who doesn't believe that the next phase, this new academic year from 20 to 21, is not going to have very similar challenges to last year. We need to make sure that students are involved in reflecting on their own practice, in getting good at making judgments themselves, at comparing their work at other things, and recognising how they need to change the work themselves. It has to depend on their inner feedback. We've also got to move away from everything being done at the same time. Because if we make it asynchronous, then if we do have problems, things don't fall over as easily. And also, anybody who's tried to manage simultaneous exams in different nations as part of a franchise programme with our universities will know how impossible it is to try and align assessments which are synchronous in different time zones. No sudden deaths, got to be less reliance on a single occasion, and they need to be inclusive. We need to be able to make sure that all assessments have reasonable adjustments, and these don't just mean giving students extra time. So, in part 2, I'm going to walk you through there's got to be a better way of assessing, and I'm going to give some practical examples of how you can design assignments that are more authentic, that can replace exams and other very restrictive forms of assessment, and that actually can benefit students and be transformative as part of the learning process.
Thank you, Sally. The first part was, as we expected, very informative and thought-provoking. We have a few questions coming over here. And before we start on the question, can I ask those people who use Twitter to use the hashtag Teams Wellbeing, please? And I think Sally has already covered a point of cheating in the first part, but we have Kate Richardson and Mira Vogel talking about two different aspects of it. Kate says, we also have lots of staff who are concerned about unfair means in online or open book assessment. How can we persuade them that exams or exam conditions aren't the only way to avoid cheating? And Mira goes on about the similar aspect as well. I've been trying to figure out how to persuade colleagues to diversify assessments and not turn immediately proctoring technology to solve social problems. I was despondent to read the recent THE piece, which included the quote, if the instructor did not want us to cheat, they would not make it so easy for us to do so. Any thoughts?
Yeah, that's quite scary, isn't it, Shiv? All of that's quite scary. Let's just think about exams and cheating, because, of course, people have been cheating in exams for many, many years. People used to call exams anti-plagiarism devices. Well, they work up to a point, but every year we have academic problems, academic conduct problems with people who are cheating. And Stephen Brookfield is the man who has written 17 different ways in which students can cheat. And he includes quite a few about how they cheat in exams. My favourite one is the crystal pen. You know, the pen that's got clear perspex. I've hunted around in the study, can't find one. But you can get 12 sheets of A4 paper into a crystal pen. It doesn't write very well, but it's very well known. In the olden days, girls used to write under their skirts, and then when the invigilator came around, would fluff their skirt down so that they couldn't see. Boys used to write on the inside of their inner arm, and they could hide that easily. So let's pretend that exams stop cheating. I think, however, what I did see in the beginning of lockdown, where universities were saying, oh, well, we'll just use the questions we've all prepared, but make them open book exams. From where I sit, that wasn't a very good idea, because it just opened up the opportunity for students to quite logically and sensibly, in difficult circumstances, to say, what are you putting down? Because too many of those questions were designed about, tell us what you can remember. What we've got to do, I talk about this quite a lot in some of my papers with Kay, we've got to design a kind of question that asks them to go from within their self, that is reflective, that is idiosyncratic to them and their context, that asks them to think about what they've been learning and what they've been doing. And those are not only difficult to cheat on in open book exams, they're also quite difficult to commission somebody else to write. We won't ever get past essay mills, I don't think, and I'm passionate about trying to stop essay mills being able to operate legally in countries. But the more you make it about individual context and performance, the better. Also, one more thing, because you'd like me to go on to another question, wouldn't you, Shiv?
No, please go on. I think
one more thing on that. If you say it's sudden death, you've got one opportunity to do it and hand it in, that makes it relatively straightforward to plagiarize and indeed to use an essay mill. But if you then say to students, I want to see in week 2, I want to see your literature review. In week 4, I want to see a sample section. In week 6, I'd like to see your draft conclusions. This doesn't have to be hugely intensive for you because it can be quite quick to look at, but it does mean, and particularly you can use peers to look at them and discuss them. It does mean that they're not just handing over something, I hesitate to use the word oven ready, but handing over something completely finished at the last minute, and then you've got very little idea how they produced it. I'm going to briefly mention remote proctoring, which I started calling cyber invigilation at the beginning when I first came across it. Now, I've done some work with a company called Uniwise, who are somebody who are working very closely with the Open University, and I was very convinced about the techniques they're using to allow us to look at, for example, retinal scans to see who is using that particular computer, and also to allow laptops to be locked down other than to use, say, specific databases. I'm getting more jumpy about the whole area of cyber invigilation. That is to say, things that are intrusive and require you to run your camera around the room and show what's there. That strikes me as inappropriate. I think we've got to find ways, if you're going to do unseen exams, to organise that. But what we've got at the moment isn't hugely satisfactory. I think the best practice is coming out of the Danish company Uniwise, set up as a spin-off from one of the Danish universities. But even there, I'm not completely able to say I would endorse it fully. Now, I have to just say I can't read the notes as well as the same time as answer a question. So you'll need to help me on that, Shiv.
Absolutely. I think I'll just go on to one question, and we've got a few more comments coming up which I can read to you. The second question is on professional bodies, PSRBs, and there's one particular healthcare professional body who expects exams, and it's much more specific and instructive on what type of assessments a program should have. And there's also a general perception that PSRBs can be a barrier to any kind of assessment changes because traditionally certain things are approved, so there is kind of an expectation and perceived barrier. So any way you could address this?
Yeah. And the glib answer is, who are the professional and subject regulatory bodies? They are us. We have to change them. We have to infiltrate them. We have to get inside them and persuade them that there's a better way. But this isn't a quick job. What was interesting was when we were looking at what was happening at the beginning of COVID shutdown, I was talking to colleagues in universities and saying, oh, I guess Law Society are being very difficult about this, are they? Guess the Engineering Council are making it troublesome for colleagues. And actually, I was hearing that some of them were much better than others. For example, I gather the medics were quite flexible about allowing for different approaches. And I think the key thing we've got to do is we've got to challenge. We've got to do that collectively. We've got to say, no, we don't think this is the best way of doing it. And we've got to challenge, as I say, collectively and by getting inside the professional bodies. And my experience over the last 10 years is that there is less resistance to alternative forms of assessment than there was in the previous decades. Now, I'm just going to pick up on one myself because I'm following one on Lindy Blaze, who's talking about differences in assessment and ethnicity. I think there's more, Lindy Ann, about differences in national approaches to assessment published than there is about ethnicity approaches. And Wendy Garnham was saying you've got initial data that suggests that MCQs, doing them online, extended quizzes, have helped to close the BAME gap, and I'd like to know why. I just want to hop back to Lindy Ann to the point that if you've got people coming from a country where most of the assessment is unseen time-constrained exams which last no longer than an hour, and they come into a system where there are very different approaches, where students are, for example, asked to be able to stand up in public and defend a position, or are asked to put two different points of view and make a judgment between them. That's going to be difficult for people coming from a country where there is one party line and one you can stick to. And I particularly point you to the work of Jude Carroll and Jeanette Ryan, Jeanette with a J, Jude Carroll and Jeanette Ryan, who've both written extensively on international perspectives on assessment. I've done a little bit myself, but I'm probably a bit dated now. I would like to say I'd like us to think about what students have done before and preparing them for this assessment, rather than trying to say, oh, well, one group of students. I mean, there is quite a thing that says students from Confucian heritage countries are more likely to do X or Y because of the nature of the kind of education they have here. That's true. But I've been working with Hong Kong University, Hong Kong Education University, and various others, and I would say that those perceptions are not particularly true. What Jude Carroll says is that where students are struggling and embattled, that's when they'll be more likely to cheat. So let's make the opportunities for students who are coming from different backgrounds into our own national systems as equitable as possible by explaining our rationales as we possibly can. I'm just going to throw in one more thing before I let you take the next question, Shiv, and that is, if you don't know the work of the Newcastle University Writing Development Centre, some of you know Helen Webster, who's the head of it, from Twitter as Scholastic Rat. The two videos that they have a whole YouTube channel, but the two videos that I've seen where she talks to students about critical thinking, and where she talks to students about an essay where you have to take a particular stance, she explains it in a way that is so clear and so lucid and so effective. When I watched it, I thought, you know what? Maybe us old girls should step aside and leave the world to the Helen Websters of this world. If you didn't get what the name, it's Helen Webster's work at the Newcastle University Writing Development Centre. And if you've been following Twitter, there's a link to her work recently.
Thank you for that. And we'll have one last question before we go on to part 2. And I'm going to pick Karen's question. Totally agree that we need to design inclusive assessments. What are your thoughts on the feasibility of designing assessments that align with learning outcomes without even really needing reasonable adjustments? And in my mind, we also need to be careful about how we articulate learning outcomes to allow for flexibility of assessments.
Right, and just to pick up on the point that's coming through, Confucian heritage means those nations which come from our heritage with the philosophy of Confucius. Thank you for that clarity, QAA Zoom. Right, your question now is about inclusive assessment. Inclusive assessment, for me, works best when we do risk assessment and contingency planning well before any students present with special or other needs. If we leave it until somebody presents, we're then scrabbling around at the last minute. And I have worked with university where the reasonable assessment always comprises giving them extra time. This is a nightmare, especially if you've got chronic fatigue syndrome. I mean, have a look at my fingers. Those are arthritic fingers that can't type fast. Can you see they're going in different directions? Giving me extra time doesn't help at all because my fingers get tired. I don't type after an hour, which if you've had messages from me which I've dictated, you'll notice, because I find dictating so much easier. Right, what we've got to do is design in assessments that relate to the learning outcomes, that offer opportunities for students to present evidence of achievement, and I'll be doing a little bit about this in the second half, in a variety of ways. Now, people say, oh, if you offer too many choices, it'll make it too difficult. But the bigger the cohort, the greater likelihood it is that if you offer different means by which students can present evidence, of achievement from the outset, then that makes a dramatic difference, and you have far, far fewer reasonable adjustments. For anybody who's working from outside the UK, we have legislation in the UK that says you have to provide reasonable adjustments for students who've notified you of a disability or other special needs, so that you can allow them to have an equitable chance to be assessed. So we want to do that in ways that are going to make it possible for everybody to give their best at the time. On to the second half, which is about learning outcomes. You might be interested. Chris Rust, used to be at Oxford Brookes University, wrote a fascinating article, I think back maybe as early as the 90s, that we should be assessing individual learning outcomes rather than jam too many together in modules or programs. Might be worth having a look at that, because then if you were assessing individual learning outcomes and there was some element of choice for students, if, for example, you had somebody with a very disabling speech impediment, they could choose elements of a program that didn't require them to do a presentation live in front of 50 people. Are you with me? So it's a big topic area, and there's lots more to be said by people with much more expertise than me. But I think the way to go is to risk assess, plan in advance, and look for ways in which we can offer choice. Choice about format, choice about evidence presentation, and choice, dare I say it, about timing. Why can't we allow students to be assessed when they are ready to be assessed, rather than when it's convenient for our system? Thank you, Sam Humphreys, Writing Development Centre. There's the YouTube channel. Can I very much hope that you can follow that up. The author I've just mentioned, Amy, was Chris Rust. It's a very old article on individual learning outcomes. Before that, it was Helen Webster at the Writing Development Centre. Before that, it was Jude Carroll and Jeanette Ryan writing on plagiarism and cheating. Thank you.
Yeah.
Do you want me to do another question now, or do you want me to go
We'll hold till the end of second part, and we have a few more questions coming up.
Super. Thank you.
Welcome back to the second part of my presentation on improving assessment long-term post-COVID, in which I'm going to talk about compassionate assessment for both staff and students. It's compassionate for students because it's more authentic and makes them feel more engaged, and it's more compassionate for staff in that I hope some of the techniques I'm going to show you here are going to make it easier for you to devise these kinds of assessment. I've said before, I've said it now, I'll say it again, we have to find a better way to do it, because assessment has to be more meaningful to students. We've had a wonderful opportunity under COVID to change things. Now let's not ever go back to the old ways of doing things. When I talk about authentic assessment, I'm building on definitions of Villarreal and others. When we're talking about assessment going beyond memorization, what we want is to have assessment that prepares students for the complex demands of life and work, so that they can achieve deep learning. So it does incorporate memory, but also analysis and transfer, so that students progressively become more familiar with the cognitive complexity required. Lots of people talk about authentic assessment as if it's only about employability, and indeed it does aim to replicate tasks and performance standards typically found in the world of work as an element, and that's why Villarreal and others again are very keen to see it in place, because it enables students to practice and demonstrate and be assessed on their problem solving, their autonomy, their self-motivation and regulation, metacognition, working with others, all those things that are related to employability. But for me and Kay and many others, authenticity implies more than this. We want it to involve cognitive challenge, the development of the ability to be thoughtful about how they are learning themselves, shaping identity, building their confidence, and helping them grow towards active citizenship. Assessment's got to be transformative in that it changes the students themselves and stimulates engagement. So we want it to be a means by which students learn by participation. When you come to writing more authentic assessment, what we're asking students to do is likely to be much more meaningful. As Noel Entwistle, a great Scottish scholar, somebody whose work I follow deeply, he's keen to see people being more engaged and adopting deep rather than surface approaches. It's also proven to be the case that where students can see the purpose of what they're doing and see how that relates to their future lives and selves, they'll be more thoughtful and more likely to relate it to real life and to take it more seriously. And in any case, authentic assessment is much less boringly dull for both students and for those of us who have to mark it. There are some downsides, probably. It's probably quicker to write an exam question, although you do have problems getting good ones every year and a tendency to fall back on formulaic approaches, and that whole danger of students' question spotting, which is terribly risky. And maybe the scenarios are harder to draft, although it's probable that if you're working in the domain, you're quite likely to be familiar with the kind of context which would make the basis of a good question. And some staff who are unfamiliar with the approach might find it difficult to develop and use these multifaceted questions. So here we're offering you a handy little task generator. We reckon there are 6 steps to designing authentic assessment, and the starting point is going to be the learning outcome. If these are good learning outcomes, they're going to have wonderful, powerful, driving verbs at the heart of them. So we want students to interpret or research or review or set up and calibrate or evaluate and compile. But then we need that to be followed with what we want them to set up and calibrate or whatever. What do you want them to do? What's the focus of the action? So, for example, produce a digital learning pack or provide a professional opinion in the form of a letter with appendices. Then the next stage is we need to have a think about what will be the evidence of achievement, so you'll know when you see it whether students have reached that learning outcome or not. Once you've got those steps in place, you need to preface it with some context around the subject or professional area, and then complete it with modifiers, developers, or what we used to call in the olden days with BTEC, range statements, which give you a rough idea of the kind of thing you're looking for. So here we are looking at a very simple approach. So we start with a verb. It might be interpret or review or set up or evaluate or compile, and then the object, the what. Interpret complex and sometimes incomplete or conflicting data. What will the evidence look like? Well, you could compile a summary that's meaningful for experts and lay people alike. And what are our modifiers or extra bits leading to a viable action plan? Similarly, review data from a variety of sources, produce an executive summary for a specific audience, set up specialised equipment appropriately, draw up a quick guide for peers. That'll show you really understand it and might actually be useful. That will enable them to use it safely and appropriately. We want them to be able to evaluate, for example, 3 proposed solutions to a problem and then propose a further 2 of your own. The good old Phil Race else factor. What more could you include? With suggestions about what might work best. And then compile contingency plans for a professional environment in terms of a disaster recovery plan in case of a serious emergency, leading to mitigations and remediation. So that's what I'm aiming for. What about some practical examples? In our paper on writing better assessments post-COVID, Kay and I have suggested an approach, which is the one I'm talking about here, starting with the learning outcomes, verb, object, outcome, evidence of achievement and context. You can see that's across the bottom. Thanks enormously to Katrina Swanton of Edinburgh Napier University, who did this sketch note of our paper, which I think sets it out very nicely for us. Here are some of the things that you could ask them to do, the evidence if you like. Electronic or hard copy portfolio, or viva voce or rough guides or annotated publication, in-tray or inbox exercises, presentations, flowcharts, all these different things you might like to see in that third of our paper where we've written pros and cons. And the worked examples I'm going to show you next are students being asked to produce a case study pack, a learning pack and a consultant's opinion. First one, early years teaching. The exam question might have been, what approaches to struggling young readers are available to teachers and what are the benefits and disadvantages of each? Here's a early reader, he's not struggling, he's my grandson Lucas, but I thought him holding the apples he's picked from my apple tree might cheer you up. Here's my alternative. It's a case study. In your class you have a boy, Kai. Kai is not Lucas. Kai's from a disadvantaged background who's really struggling to get beyond sounding words out. From your experience, because I want them to recognise that they've got things to bring to this, they may well have been classroom assistants before they were trainee teachers. From your reading around the topic, because we want them to do that, and they should reference it appropriately, draw up a table to help you consider the potential advantages and disbenefits of each of the following interventions you could use to support Kai, and say how each might help him progress. Please also suggest one more course of action. Again, trying to extend beyond the suggestions we've got here. Provide a conclusion in which you show your plan of action for the next 12 weeks and justify your choices of approach. Now, this is a real example. I work alongside normally not in COVID times, I work alongside a brilliant classroom teacher who is in year 1, and I go in to help with the reading. I worked alongside her while she was doing a master's degree, and she was trying all sorts of different interventions. So here are 4 that she could have tried. Sending home a letter to Kai's parents, asking them to read with him every day for the next 12 weeks. Asking your classroom volunteer, that's me, to come in for extra sessions every week for the next 12 weeks to work intensively with Kai. Make time yourself to work several times a week with Kai using flashcards to help him become familiar with a number of targeted high-frequency words, or work with the whole class over 12 weeks to learn the word of the day and thereby help Kai and all the others get confidence and familiarity. Now, I'm not going to tell you what the amazing Mrs. Turnbull did, but what I will say is her intervention with Kai, that's not his real name, actually made a dramatic difference to his learning. Here's another example. Nice boring exam question. Outline the health risks associated with an inactive lifestyle and poor diet for type 2 diabetic older females and describe what remedies could improve their health and well-being. And this is illustrated with a picture of me in my sitting room. I was a type 2 diabetic, but I've managed to more or less reverse it by losing 4 stone and doing yoga every day for at least half an hour. Let's have a look at what an alternative might look like. So, asking students to produce a learning pack. As a community sports facilitator, you've been asked to support a group of older women with type 2 diabetes who take little exercise and whose diet is less than optimum. Produce a digital learning pack targeted to help this group that might contain range statement, indicative contents, for example, self-produced and collated, visually attractive and clearly written fact sheets, checklists, recipes, invitations to participate in group activities. Now, those are the range statements, but you don't have to stick to those. Your pack should include at least 5 items and no more than 8. That's to make it manageable for you marking it. And you need a reflective commentary going alongside it, outlining your choices, which is strictly word limited, so it's not rambling on, a reference list, scientific background, short note on how you accessed information, because we want in this assignment for them to be thinking not only about the information they got, but how they accessed and prioritized it, and a statement to the extent of which your perceptions and beliefs have altered during the course of this undertaking. So showing that they've actually been transformed by undertaking the activity. Now that's a more demanding kind of a task. Here's my third example. Boring exam question, illustrated with some of Lucas's toys. Outline the legal and professional responsibilities of a company importing children's toys and games into Hong Kong and the UK in terms of health and safety. Fairly typical question. But here's the alternative. This scenario assumes you're working in a consultancy advising clients on importing and exporting goods into Hong Kong and the UK, because Hong Kong and UK had a shared legal system which is later differentiated. You've been approached by a client who's discovered that one of her suppliers of children's toys and games has been found to be using unsafe lead-based paint. That's that dinosaur, which I've taken out, for at least 5 years. Importantly there, they've got to make sure they follow the law as it might have changed over the last 5 years in Hong Kong and the UK. Draw up a brief, immediate response for your client, advising her with due caveats of the range of implications this is likely to have for her business in Hong Kong and the UK, indicating what action she needs to take pronto. Provide your opinion, which has got to be short. You can give them a guideline. An appendix that goes with it lists the relevant legislation, reference material and other information. All examples of the kinds of things you might actually see being used in real life. Here then we come to our conclusions on compassionate assessment. We need to make it manageable for staff and students. Manageable for staff who've been busting a gut for the last 6 months trying to make everything work post-COVID. People will only do additional things if they recognise that it's going to have huge benefit to students and it's not going to involve them in large amounts of extra work. It's got to assure standards, but it's also got to minimise unproductive stress, both for us, the assessors, and for the students. It's got to be manageable for them as well. We keep coming back to the two key purposes of assessment: judging, grading, evaluating, making sure students are fit to practice, fit to graduate. But also, assessment has got to build on those 4 decades of research by people like Kay and me, Liz McDowell and others, which is about assessment for learning, not just of learning. It's got to be integrated. It's got to change students. It's got to work in the service of student learning rather than just fit into university systems. And we've also got to bear in mind how we're going to manage poor academic conduct. We don't want to be all the time challenging students' trustworthiness and professionalism. We've got to write assignments that are actually much more difficult for them to cheat and plagiarise. So now is the time, more than ever before, when we can be, in assessment design, more radical, innovative and powerful in making changes than ever before. We've talked about this for many years. It's got to be truly for learning, and we need to make sure we further advance this over future years. Thank you very much. I hope you found that useful, and I look forward to discussing this further with you.
Again, a very informative and very thought-provoking part 2. I'll start with the first question and then hand over to my fellow co-host, Dr. Heather Gray. First question is from Chibi Tan. Do these same principles for compassionate assessment apply to early interviews to the programs? We are kind of judging people and assessing people and getting them into the programs.
It's a great question, and I might go on for quite a long time about this, so don't let me shiv. When we're looking at entry onto programs, I want to make sure that we are as compassionate as possible and don't artificially put off people who can really benefit from a program, but who might not have the social and cultural capital to come across in interviews as confident and as articulate as some of those who have great advantages. However, I am also very keen that universities, and some in Britain are very guilty of this, sometimes taking people onto programs where we know in advance that they haven't got a great chance of doing well. So if you're taking somebody onto a course for barristers, then it probably is not a great idea not to have them doing something where they demonstrate that they can be articulate and confident. But if we've got somebody who's going to be a research scientist, then it doesn't really matter that some of the elements that would make a great barrister are covered in the interview. Are you following me? So we need to be compassionate in our approach, while at the same time keeping in mind what is going to enable those students to make the most from that course and to actually get the very best, maximizing their own performance. My own son at one time talked about going to do a degree in English literature. I did a degree in English literature. I said to him, Pete, you don't like reading. And he said, yeah, but it's an easy course, isn't it, mother? At which point I shouted at him, as you can imagine. Heather's raising her eyes at that point, as indeed I did slightly more than that. I think we've got to be realistic in those interviews in helping people to know what's going to be demanded of them. Give them a chance. If they've got a fighting chance, give them that chance, but don't set students up to fail. A very good example of that is sometimes we are allowing students into British courses with very, very low IELTS scores. And I have heard people say, well, it doesn't really matter because we'll have got the fee off them, and if they drop out, that's a terrible attitude. So compassion, but realism.
Yeah, thanks for that, Sally. And actually, you've led seamlessly into my next question, which is from Joanna Cheetham. So she asks, have you any tips for any less vocationally focused disciplines like English literature, was actually her question.
Yeah, and that is my background. And I think very often we ask very boring questions because that's the way it's always been, and that's the way we consider it will always be. But I think we have to look at the kinds of skills. Have a look at the kind of skills. I've mentioned Helen Webster already, is asking. So if we want students to write a more interesting approach to demonstrating their critical thinking or their ability to take a position, instead of saying, compare these three texts, I think it would be better to say, what you're being asked to do is demonstrate critical thinking. Go through those 6 phases exactly as per. So what is the learning outcome you're testing? Now, what's good evidence of this? How are you going to do it? It might be an essay. It might be a display. It might be, and this is one that really works in disciplines like English literature, it might be a teaching pack for 6th formers in schools. We've got to go back to those learning outcomes and look at the kind of evidence that we are asking students to provide, and actually the right answer isn't always an exam or an essay. It can be much more positive and stretching things than those kinds of things. Thank you.
I've just got one more question here, Sally, and it's basically, how do we balance providing a range of different types of more exciting, interesting assessments, giving students a chance to practice them formatively, doing all that whilst not then overloading and overstressing staff?
Right. That's a great question, and that's why I was trying to come up with a handy generator of questions that don't require you to keep thinking all from scratch every time. And if you have a look at the paper Kay and I wrote, I've taken the same verb and put different kind of approaches along to it with Kay. so that you could use it in different subject areas or different years. I think we've got to be compassionate to staff and not expect them to come all singing and dancing every single year with something new. That's why I quite like that approach. In terms of inducting our students into innovative approaches to assessment, the worst thing we can do is throw them in at the deep end. But that's if you're thinking about assessment as being endpoint. If you think like me and Kay and Liz McDowell and others, that assessment is the learning process, then actually doing the assessment in class is the way that you're going to make learning happen positively. Somebody earlier on in the chat mentioned exemplars, and again I would point you to the resources coming out of Edinburgh Napier University. We call them enhanced guides. Edinburgh Napier enhanced guides. There's one on there, it's an open access resource on exemplars. The British idiom we use is you've got to let the dog see the rabbit. You've got to let students see examples of what you are trying to get from them. Roy Sadler, the most cited author in the world on formative assessment, says students need to be able to gauge the quality of their own work and match it to that required by the tutor during the production of their work, during the actual production. That's a bit of a misquote, but that's the gist of what he says. So we've got to let students see what good work looks like. That's one of Royce's key words. Good work. What does good work look like? This isn't giving them a paint it by numbers approach. This is allowing students into the black magic box that they sometimes think we're hiding stuff in. So it's got to be done. I think you've got to brief, you've got to rehearse, you've got to provide opportunities, real opportunities for dialogue about it. You've got to have feedback, and then you've got to run the real assessment. Now that sounds like an awful lot of work if you see it as something on top of teaching. But if, like me and Kay and others, you see as assessment as part of teaching, Kay talks a lot, this is where we're going next, thinking about the inner feedback that students have, the inner dialogues they have with themselves, where they're comparing their own work with other work and helping themselves to make judgments. This is true lifelong learning, and this is truly compassionate. And it gives the students the tools to keep being able to practice and grow and work in new contexts long, long after they graduate.
Thanks. Thanks very much, Sally. Thanks very much for all the information. And I can strongly advise people to go back and look at the recording of this afterwards, because I obviously had the recording beforehand. So this is actually the third time I've listened through.
Oh,
so, no, and I've enjoyed it each time and picked up more things each time as well. So thank you very much for joining with us. Fantastic session, full of information, full of richness, full of ideas, practical top tips as well. So just to remind everybody that we'll get the webinar recording up onto the QAA Scotland Collaborative Cluster website within the next few days, all being well. So please access it there, share it as well with all and sundry. You're welcome to do that. Thank you very much for joining with us, everybody, and all your engagement in the chat. We'll also try and make available some of the resources that people have suggested. So thanks for doing that. We're all in it together. So thanks for sharing your practice ideas and references as well. So that's our time over just now. But thank you very much, everyone. Thanks again, Sally. And we'll see you all again soon, hopefully at another event.